All right, so we're going to talk about substitution in TFDM. Just a little bit of brief history into that is a lot of it comes out of the collaborative site implementation team. One of the things that happened earlier on in CSIT was a lot of the dispatch air traffic people in the airlines came and asked, how are we going to do substitution in TFDM? And although we knew the schema, we didn't necessarily have all of the answers to that. So we made an effort to figure out the answers to those questions. Melissa Brown, Marcus Smith, Doug Swoll from MITRE helped. The engineers from TFDM helped. Isaac Robeson helped. And so it was a really collaborative effort to figure all this out. From my perspective, what I really wanted was it to be translated into English so I could understand it. And hopefully when we get through this, it'll be in a way that we can understand. We'll also take questions as we go along. We'll answer those after Melissa's presentation and then add a couple of thoughts about substitution.
So my name is Melissa Brown. Like Eric mentioned, I'm a lead engineer at MITRE. I've been with the TFDM program other than about a year hiatus since 2010, wearing quite a few hats and also involved in a lot of the 3T work that's been going on over about the last decade. So if you have questions about 3T integration and stuff, happy to chat after substitution. So just to kind of give a quick introduction to TFDM surface metering, substitution, and the ability to do substitution as part of SMP surface metering programs. So the TFDM program actually made an agreement out of the SCDM CONOPS and concept. This capability was requested by airlines back during that development. TFDM adopted requirements to support substitution. And the idea behind it was actually to mimic the substitution process that occurs in TFMS right now with things like GDPs. So it's designed to allow flexibility for operators in the airline communities to have flexibility to meet their own business decisions and their own airline needs, fleet needs, operation needs, and then also to meet SMP and capacity balance needs on the surface. So substitution in an SMP, it sounds pretty easy. It's the ability to swap two or more aircraft as part of a SMP program, single SMP program. And this could be with two flights or two or more flights that are actually operating within that program. And then you can also have the ability to, if you're going to cancel or delay a flight in a program, that you can substitute a later flight that can go earlier, go in that slot. You can submit or substitute those two flights as well. So the two aircraft or two or more aircraft don't actually all have to operate. You can have canceled flights. So the benefits of substitution, so like I mentioned before, the design is to, and the principle behind substitution is to allow the users to make priorities for their flights. So if you have a flight that is, maybe a high business need, or you have your CEO on that flight, and then you have your mother-in-law on the later flight, or the earlier flight, then you can swap them and simply swap their metering times. So it's both the departure time and then also their TMATs and associated metering times from there. So flight operators also have the ability to, quote, protect their slots during an SMP by marking them for substitution. We'll get into marking later on in this presentation, but essentially it allows you to mark specific flights that if you have intentions of canceling or severely delaying them, it protects those slots and those metering times for you to substitute other flights in. So quick overview of actual substitution. So like others have mentioned in previous workshops and previous discussions, this is all routed through a swim interface with TFDM. And this is actually a swim interface with TFDM. It's not going through TFMS. And it's called TFCS. And the intention is that substitution requests will go through the swim interface. It's not a direct connect with TFDM. Like I said, it's not a connection through TFMS. And as I mentioned before, the concept is similar to the TFMS. It was kind of modeled on that. There are differences, and there's actually a limitation that if you're a part of a TFMS program and have an edict, that would block you from being able to substitute that flight. But the principle of allowing flexibility within a single program, that was modeled after the TFMS substitution rules. It brings me to the, different rules for flights that are allowed to be substituted. So one is that SMP has to be actually affirmed, essentially approved, so it can't be a proposed SMP. Obviously, if an SMP is canceled or deferred, there's no substitutions going on for those SMPs either. And to actually be eligible for substitution, this applies to both flights being substituted, not just one of the flights being substituted. So they'll almost be part of the same program. So if you run a program from 10 to noon and then take a half an hour break and then restart at 1 o'clock, for example, you cannot swap one flight in the earlier one and one flight in the later one. So they have to be part of the same SMP. They also have to be operated by the same major carrier. This is similar to as it works in TFMS. This can include regional affiliates, though. So if you have perhaps Mesa Air operating some of your flights, then you can substitute for them, and you can substitute your own major for that regional. The flight must still be in the non-movement area, so it can't pass the spot. Now, some spots are right off the gate, so at that point, the flight should not have pushed back from the gate. The only exception is if you have marked the flight for holding in the AMA, intent to hold. This is a message that can be submitted through TFMS for a flight. That is the only exception to that rule. So a flight may not be exempt from rationing. There's a couple different things that will exempt you from rationing without going into all of them. It's just worth noting that if that flight is exempt from rationing and falls under that category, it cannot be substituted. Flights with a FAA assigned control time of departure, a CTD. So either an edict from a TFMS program that is active, so if it's simply a ground stop and then the edict gets lifted, that flight then becomes eligible for substitution. But if it has an active edict and or an active APRAC time, CFR time from TDFM, cannot be substituted. Now, if a flight there are different rules for, and this falls into the exempt from rationing, if a flight is subject to a TDFM program, so it's part of a stream that's being metered, maybe a DC to New York flight, and has not received that CFR time, depending on how that program's parameters are set up, it could or could not be exempt from substitution. This comes down to an individual, perhaps site decision. There may be a site decision which would fall into more the CSIT and P3 side. But if a site has decided to not exempt flights that have not received a CFR from rationing, then you could be substituting those flights as long as they don't have that CFR time. And if there's more detailed questions on that, get a little confusing, happy to answer them either in the session or offline. There's also rules about exact and inexact substitutions. And the substitution times that you're swapping, either the two or more, they have to match according to those rules. Any comments?
Yeah, I think that exact and inexact is kind of an interesting concept. But one of the ideas is that you can't necessarily perfectly swap two aircraft, and they may end up with different TMATs than you anticipated. Just because of where they are on the field. If one aircraft's here and one aircraft's over here, you can swap those aircraft. You can do a substitution. They might just not end up with the exact times that they had before you started that substitution. Another thought reference all of that is, why can't an edict or an APREC be one of the substitution aircraft? And I think it's important to consider the fact that TFDM respects the overhead stream, and it wants to make sure that we utilize that capacity and that we don't damage the way we deliver aircraft. So that's why we're not allowing the substitution of those aircraft in a surface metering program.
Yep. And that CFR exempt from rationing, like I said, is a program parameter. It could be decided on a program-by-program basis, could be decided on a site basis of whether to allow or to exempt those flights from rationing. So the marking for substitution, I mentioned that a little bit before, but it's the ability for you to make strategic decisions about your flights. If you know that you're going to have severe delay on the flight or it's going to be canceled, allows you to retain that metering slot. And so that is actually submitted through TFCS, and then you would eventually come along and do the substitution either immediately or later. We'll highlight that in the use cases coming up.
Yeah, I looked at that as one of the English translations that helped me out a lot. So if you, like she was saying, if you have a flight that you've canceled 2 hours out, you can, before you cancel the flight, flag it, then cancel, and then as it progresses along, it maintains its slot in the surface for you to substitute your own flights with. The other ones you're doing match for match within the program itself.
I'm going to check questions at this point. And we're happy to take old school, raising your hand. Anybody has any questions to this point before we launch into? Yes. From an airline side, so hold that question. We have 2 use cases that go through just kind of a standard substitution, and then also one that would deal with flight cancellations and marking. So if you don't mind, let me see if that answers your questions, and then we can come back. So rationing from, so exempt from rationing essentially means that that flight would receive 0 metering hold. So for example, a call for release flight, it already has a CTD, let's say the CTD is 1300. Then TFDM will align your estimated takeoff time, your estimated wheels up time to meet that CFR. So it may be within the compliance window. And then backing up the surface metering times, especially the TMAT, you wouldn't receive any additional gate hold. You would just meet whatever time that TFDM is trying to depart you off that runway. So.
Who's going to be enforcing? Who would be more or less policing the times, make sure we had compliance with the substitution and pushing back on time?
I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, one of the factors with the TFCS and with the way the substitution is written is if it doesn't comply with all of the components and the rules of the substitution, it has to give you a rejection message and it has to tell you why you were rejected. So let's say we were metering to runway 36 and you were trying to swap it with an aircraft going to runway 27, and it will tell you because of the runway issue. It'll reject it and it will give you the reason why. Or if it was different SMPs, or if it was an aircraft that was rationed by the schedule.
So in TFSM, when you substitute in the IOC through the SWIM platform, will that automatically now feed over into the departure metering program? Because you say those are now static.
So it's going to be through TFCS. There's several different feeds within SWIM. TFMS is going to be how you do your flight plans, your flight modifies, reflecting how you do things now. For substitution and ramp closures, it's going to be the request reply service that you use for TFDM. So that TTP is just data coming out to you that you can read. It's a publication subscription, where this one is a request reply where you interact with it through TFCS in SWIM, not TFM.
Is there still a freeze horizon associated with these with the substitutions?
There is.
Yes.
And she'll go
yeah,
into
and
this.
that's part of the use cases.
Yeah.
And one last question. This will be a function probably more than likely, or we would prefer for the IOC, and it needs to feed back into the ramp traffic console for situational awareness, not only to the hub control centers, the ramp towers, but also over to the FAA so they have situational awareness. So that adds an extra, I guess, tool or screen to look at. So I just want to know, is that in your vision for the conduit?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Just a general conversation reference that. So I think that's when we talked earlier about policy and procedures for the airlines and how you're going to interact with the system. When we talk about flagging an aircraft for substitution that you're going to cancel the flight an hour out, that's pretty easy to do at the IOC. If a tow bar breaks on the ramp and you're trying to switch airplanes that are 4 or 5 minutes apart, like we saw at JFK, done successfully, that might require a little autonomy and tools at your ramp towers and at that level to empower them to make those decisions. Those are certainly decisions that are made by each individual airline and carrier, but those are things you might need to think about.
I have a question with a couple of components to it. Here, so first off, you mentioned how we could retain a canceled slot in this program, correct?
Yes, through the marking.
Okay. So where do you get the demand data for this program? Is it through TFMS?
Yeah, so it's flights that TFDM is aware of. So primarily through TFMS. That's where the planning information would come from. ERAM flight strips, course count too. So it's what demand TFDM is aware of from a flight data perspective.
Okay, and I'm assuming then that if the flight is canceled and we have a canceled slot within TFMS, that it would just carry over to ATD-2 or the TFMS, I'm sorry.
TFDM.
TFDM.
There's a lot
Too
of
many
T's.
acronyms.
Yeah, there's a lot of T's.
Okay.
That's why they call them the 3 T's.
Yes.
Yes, that's what I was just about to say. So we have a use case for this, and essentially the flow of information is that, so prior to a program actually being affirmed, then flight operators would put in that mark for substitution as a message for that flight. That flight has to be, like Mike said, has to be marked prior to that cancellation going through. If you simply just cancel the flight, then TFDM would try to fill in that slot with a flight, whether it's yours or so your airlines. If you don't have any flights available to move into that slot, then it would go out to the general pool demand at that airport that is affected by the SMP.
Another important thought I think on that is that that flag doesn't stay there forever. Eventually TFDM will reclaim that if you don't use it, but she'll explain in the use cases exactly how that works.
All right, so yes. So the question over here is it a two-step process? Do you have to submit the marking for substitution through TFDM, through TFCS, and then submit the cancellation? And the answer is yes. No.
I can sub that flight, like
As
a
long as
hold
you-
flag in TFMS.
As long as you submit the marking for substitution prior to the cancellation.
So you're not going to use the hold flag in TFMS. We have to do two separate processes.
And I think one thing to think about is you can put the hold flag on, but until there is an SMP, you're not actually doing any substitution. There has to be an active SMP to do it.
Right. So I'm going to move actually through the next couple slides, especially the use cases. It might either spark more questions or hopefully answer some questions. So just some key substitution terminology. This is more for reference. I'm not going to read every single word on this slide. There's a lot. But the data elements and terminology in TFDM that comes into play in substitution, sort of course, EOBT is important because that's what's driving the surface metering times. That's what's driving things like inclusion into an SMP, whether you can substitute. The marking for substitution, talked about it at length, and we'll go into the actual application of it in the use case. The two that I want to highlight here is protection period and the reclamation window. These are essentially where the automation and then also the user, so the airline, is going to, the time frames that matter when it comes to substitution. The TFDM system is going to attempt to reclaim, hence the name, these metering times during the reclamation window. So if you're outside that reclamation window for a single flight, TFDM is not going to try to take back that time immediately. If you are, that's where the protection period comes in, though. And the protection period is essentially the time that TFDM will allow you, the user, to make a decision about substituting a flight before it will attempt to reclaim that slot. The static time horizon also comes into play. We'll see that in the use case. And again, static time horizon is simply when TFDM is starting to freeze those surface metering times for your awareness, for situational awareness for the tower, so that there's some sort of plan that everybody is working towards. And then TMATs and TOBTs are the surface metering times that are going to be change as part of substitution. And like Eric said, that's where the inexact and exact substitution rules come in. Okay, so the first scenario and use case is more of a simple substitution. This is what we'd expect to see probably pretty often in terms of all the substitutions occurring. So just to run through kind of the setup and a frame of or context for this scenario. So we're saying we're at LAX and that their surface metering program, so an S&P is actually active and it's beginning at 1600 and goes through 1900. So it's been coordinated and affirmed and entered into the system. Current time right now is 1635, so we're actually in that period. And I'm just listing 2 flights here with times, and static time horizon is 30 minutes, so that's part of S&P parameters. And then that reclamation window that I was referred to in the previous slide is set to 40 minutes, and then the protection period is 10 minutes. So the timeline across the bottom just kind of shows a frame of reference for the time. And then on the left there is the light pink, almost purple, is the reclamation window, and then the dark pink, magenta, is the protection period. So stepping through what would occur in a substitution event. So first, there's some condition that the flight operator determines is going to maybe cause a substitution. Something could be, in this example, we're using a baggage belt fails, could be you're waiting on a passenger, could be you're waiting on a new tug, or simply bags making it onto the plane. For some reason, the flight operator determines that the flight's going to be delayed, and it's estimated at about 20 minutes. So the dispatch would then update the EOBT for that flight that's going to be delayed. And if you look in that yellow box, so the original EOBT of 1640, the 20-minute delay then pushes it to 1700. So that EOBT is entered in for that flight. As a result of this timing, that flight is actually inside this reclamation window. So the TFDM is only going to allow that protection period for you, the user, to take action. That protection period is then 10 minutes. So you essentially have 10 minutes to decide, do I want to substitute this flight? Do I want just TFDM to reassign the TMAT and let it go? Maybe you only have 1 or 2 flights and you have nobody else no other flights that you can substitute into that slot. That decision needs to get made in this 10 minutes essentially. So it's not a lot of time, but it is that period to allow TFDM to take back that slot if you don't take action in that 10 minutes. So this is where the flight operator will make the decision how to use that TMAT that is going to now be sitting empty as a result of the delayed flight. So there's a protection period just for awareness. So like I said, you have the 10 minutes, so 1645 to decide what you want to do. At this point, the airline decides, yeah, I have another flight that I can move earlier and it's ready to go. We're finishing up boarding for it. So the airline will submit a substitution request to TFDM via the TFCS interface, swapping these 2 aircraft and substituting the surface metering times between these 2 aircraft. Yes? Yes.
That's correct.
No marking for substitution. Yes. Yes, this is the
Okay.
pretty standard basic substitution. No marking, no cancellations. Just a flight is going to get delayed by a small amount of time, and you're making a decision to swap a later flight because you know it's ready to go.
So that's the strategic versus tactical. One's 2 hours out that you're flagging. You don't know who you're going to substitute with, or even if you're going to substitute because you're not 100% sure there's going to be SMP, you expect it because it happens every day at the same time. This one is, in the moment where you actually swap them out because of a situation. And no flag required, just the substitute.
This is just a message sent indicating those 2 flights should get substituted. That's it. So these flights could have been marked previously. They could not have. That does not matter in this scenario. So there's the switcheroo, and then TFDM automation will approve this request since they don't have any other conditions against them that would exempt them from being able to substitute the flights. So TFDM approves the request, reassigns the TMATs. These new TMATs will go out over TTP. TFDM schedule will get updated, and the 2 flights will continue on to meet their new times.
Any other questions about that before we go to the next scenario?
So after you substitute them, they get swapped TMAT times, but you said in some situations they may not be the exact same times?
They might not be the exact. They could be a
Why
minute or
is-
2 difference. And the nice...
Okay.
Yeah, so
And
if
the
you
other-
have a ramp transit time that's like a minute or 2 longer in an instance.
Okay.
The other part about it, too, with the inexact match is it might recognize the fact that you're not going to be able to make the best time. Well, let's say the one that's been bumped up isn't going to make that time, but it'll be a few minutes later, and it's okay with that within the system.
Okay. And then after you do the substitution, goes back through the TTP feed via swim, and so then it'll show up on any ramp tools we have.
If you're displaying TMATs, and TOBTs, the new information will be published out. And as soon as TFDM approves it, updates the schedule, and then republishes, it'll be available for consumption.
All right. Do you know how long that takes? Have you done a prototype yet?
I believe the performance on the TTP is a minute, or better than a minute. I don't remember that off the top of my head.
Okay. Thanks.
And then of course there's time for the system to update. So
You know that answer, Eric?
yeah, I know it's a minute or better in the requirement. It's just a matter of what it is in real life.
The other thing that maybe we didn't explain well enough is the static time horizon. The concept behind that is locking down times for human factors so that you know when to push and when to taxi within a certain window, that it's not going to be jumping around, that the times aren't going to be jumping around. So in this scenario, that static time horizon is moving along the timeline, and it's 40 minutes. But that is actually an adaptable by site window.
And actually, that's a good point for the reclamation windows and the protection periods. Those move along with a single flight tow. So it's kind of this rolling timeline that goes along with each of the flights.
Yes. Regarding this scenario here, so somebody determines there's a surface metering program. Can you explain who determines that and what are the parameters that would
So
cause
again,
it to be implemented?
Yeah, Mike, thanks. I think that goes back again to the whole local collaboration. I think that's what CSIT's pushing for with the local LOAs. And if you don't set up parameters in advance, then we're going to kind of defeat the point of having electronic communication, right? We're going to be on the phone all the time discussing, should we be in a metering program? Shouldn't we be in a metering program? I know from being a controller for 25 years at DCA that at 8 o'clock every morning I'm having a push. And I think we could all agree to that. And then we all kind of negotiate what number through the LOA we want in advance. And then maybe kind of what leeway we want to provide for the TMU, whether they want to push it up or down, or maybe no leeway. Maybe we lock in those numbers, and if we want to change that, we would have to have a conference call. But I think that's decided at the local level by the local users.
And you know, to avoid a lot of churn and work and everything else, I would think there'd be some automation in this scenario to say, hey, my EOBT changed by 20 minutes, whatever it is. And it would say, well, I'm now going to be late, so depict that. And then if there's anybody ahead of that, that you can like do a slot credit substitution and move them forward automatically internally within the computer. Nobody has to change anything. There's automation. And then what it does, it gives you that graphical view of what's happening on the surface. And if you see these lines, being delayed even more and more for a variety of reasons, oh, now I have to take some action and maybe, you know, run this program all the time, but only then implement it once we start getting into some bottlenecks or some thresholds. But I'm just really concerned about a lot of churn, a lot of work, when maybe some of it could be automation.
So I'm going to answer, but I bet Melissa will answer better after me. So if you bumped an aircraft back, inside the static time horizon, we're not going to really bump times around. It's the idea of creating stability. But if it's after the static time horizon or before the static time horizon takes place, it will try to replace, the system will try to replace it with your own flights to see who it can bump up to help out. If it can't find any of your own flights, it will take somebody else. But it will automatically try to replace your slot with your aircraft. If it can do it, reference the EOBTs.
Yeah.
Oh, good. I got that one
Yeah,
right.
you got it right. So TFDM is doing some automatic activities to fill in these slots in the background, especially outside the static time horizon. If there's enough change in the schedule, TFDM will automatically update. However, like you said, once you're inside that static time horizon, if there is a need to, if the airline doesn't think it'll meet its EOBT, it's on the airline to submit that update to TFDM for TFDM to either do reassignments. If you update the EOBT by a minute, you may still be able to meet your surface metering times. You probably will. If it's an update by 20 minutes and you update it and then you don't submit a substitution, TFDM takes back that slot and will try to fit other planes into it, but it's relying on the airlines providing up-to-date information as much as it is for the automation on the TFDM side to make the schedule executable, essentially achievable.
And one other point is, in the static time horizon, it's not a never change scenario. It's just a mostly don't change scenario. And an example would be, it would have to be extreme, like a ramp closure happens because of a fuel spill and 7 aircraft aren't showing up the way we expected them to. Then it might start compressing. They call it compression.
Yeah, but even
compressing times, but it would be a highly unusual situation.
Even compression takes user action from the ATC from the TFDM side. So, and we expect all of these activities to go on with collaboration. You know, if flights are starting to get canceled, then TFDM might recommend change to the program or even a cancellation of the program if the demand is suddenly shifting that doesn't warrant an S&P anymore. And all those recommendations would go on in the background, but the single most important thing is TFDM has to have good information to be making all these automatic recommendations and changes. If it's working with bad data submitted, then it can't do a whole lot with it.
So the automatic substitutions it does in the background, is that going off major code? Is it considering the regionals?
So I wouldn't call them automatic substitutions necessarily. I mean, substitutions, we're really limiting those to external input to swap 2 or more flights. But the automatic scheduling that's going on in the background, it's considering, it's trying to move slots that if your airline is moving flights and is going to try to move your own airlines into those slots, but if it can't, it'll pull from the general demand pool.
Okay, so regionals under the same major code?
As long as they're in the same major code.
Okay, and there's no reason that the airlines wouldn't want this automation going on?
Not that I can
I don't see why not.
As long as we got the EOBTs is a key.
Yeah, I mean, as long as your EOBTs are reflective of your intent to operate, then that's the entire intent of those is for airlines to provide the system saying this is when we'd like to operate this aircraft and begin the operational phase. So as long as that's kept up to date, TFDM is going to try. I mean, TFDM's business is not to artificially spread out a schedule. It'll try to achieve what the airlines want to, or the times that the airlines want to operate.
You want to try the next scenario?
Sure. There's one more question in the back, but
Okay, we'll do the question in the
we'll
back.
do one more question and.
You may have mentioned this, and I may have missed it. But is the substitution on this? Is it just a 1-for-1, or is it have the capability of doing a cascading substitution like it is in TFMS with the SCS program?
You can do more than 2 as part of a single request. You just have to identify who's going in what slot. So if you want to submit 10 and you're just shuffling everybody up one spot and the first guy to the very end. All right. There's the 7 and 8 are just the new times that are being published out. But so the second scenario, this is the marking for substitutions. Like Eric was saying, the intent of this is a lot more strategic action on the operator side. So just to set up the scenario, there is a surface metering program that's beginning at 1600, running through 1900, like the last one. This program hasn't been affirmed yet, and this is kind of important. It'll be affirmed at 1400, so that's when TMATs are going to be assigned. And even though they may still move, since the early ones are outside the static freeze horizon, that is when the times will be assigned, and that is when the tower controllers or tower personnel have said this program is going to be essentially click and confirmed at 1400. So the 2 flights that we're looking at do have EOPT submitted. Static time horizon is still 30 minutes, reclamation window is still 40 minutes, and protection period is still 10 minutes. Those parameters are the same as the previous scenario. So current time is 1200. So the airline operator intends to cancel a flight due to a snowstorm coming in an arrival airport, or they just intend to cancel it for other reasons. Either way, that airline has made a strategic decision to either cancel or severely delay an aircraft or flight. That is when you start to use the marking for substitution. So that airline knows that the surface metering program is part of the collaborative decision making going on at the local airport. They do know that it'll be implemented at 1400, so they have awareness of an SMP going to be affirmed at 1400. They know that that flight is going to be canceled in this case, and they determine that they don't want to use that or lose that slot in the surface metering program. They may have other aircraft that they're going to try to push out earlier, so they want to hold on to that surface metering time. So this is where the airline would use the TFCS interface, the SWIM interface, to TFDM, and submit a mark for substitution message for that flight that they intend to cancel. They would do that first. This goes back to the earlier question. So you'd want to do that message submission to TFDM first before you actually cancel the flight. So TFDM automation accepts the marking message and then would actually respond with an acknowledgement message. So then at 1400, when the SMP is scheduled to be affirmed and initiates, TFDM is going to assign a TMAT to that flight. And then at the same point, it's those reclamation rules still count here. So because the reclamation window is 40 minutes and the protection period is 10 minutes, they actually have until 1655 to make a business decision on when to or how to use that TMAT. So either substitute in another flight, or they can decide to just let that slot go. At this point, they've decided to use that slot, but they have until that time to make a decision. So at 1630, so before that time, they do locate another flight that they can move earlier into that slot. So they then have to submit another substitution request message to substitute those 2 flights. So the process is submit the marking for substitution of the flight that you're going to cancel or delay, submit the cancellation message if applicable, and then you do have to submit another substitution message. And this is the marking and the substitution messages are submitted through TFCS. So the new flight has the updated metering times. And then since the slot that the new aircraft is outside, so the flight that they substituted into that canceled flight slot is outside the static time horizon, TFDM will use its ration by schedule algorithm to fill that TMAT slot that's been vacated. So this goes back to, I think, to your point about how TFDM is automatically moving flights back into holes vacated by substituted flights.
Any other questions about that? I see
All right.
processing going on.
Yeah, we'll keep going in
this
the
is
light
the
of time.
simple-
I know this is a lot,
This
so
is a simple English translation, by the way.
hopefully. I've been speaking TFDM for a long time, so. That's a substitution request, like a typical one. So it's the same process as before.
But you can do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've actually seen some questions submitted electronically that gets into this frequently asked questions. We just have a couple of topics that we get asked a lot as a program, and wanted to highlight a couple of these. So if we substitute flights in a TFMS program, or if we substitute flights in TFMS for flights that are affected by a GDP, will this affect my TMATs in the SMP? And the answer is yes. So, and take a moment to say that TFDM will attempt to schedule runway times that align with any control time departures, either TBFM or TFMS. So, and like I mentioned before, with the zero metering hole, TFDM will assign TMATs that will help achieve those runway departure times to meet those CTDs. So if you make a swap of two edicts, the TMATs will update accordingly. If a flight is assigned a CFR, it'll receive a TMAT that will allow it to depart to meet that CFR. That ETOT may not be the exact CFR or the exact edict, but will be within the window.
I think that's a real important point. It's not a double substitution requirement for you.
Yeah.
If you substitute for the edicts and the TFM.
Which then gets to my next point about the reminder that edict flights actually can't be substituted in TFDM because, of course, if you substitute two TMATs, then you run the risk that you're not going to make your edicts. So, but you can do it the other way around, swap the edicts, and then the surface metering program will respond. So the next question we get a lot is, can we use the TFM data request reply service to request substitutions in SMP? The short answer is no. So substitution requests, the marking for substitutions, have to go through the TFDM swim feed, the TFCS, which is its own request reply service. Another question is, if we cancel a flight that has a TMAT, are we required to substitute a flight into that TMAT to prevent losing the slot? The answer is it depends. So if you're outside the static time horizon, like the example we just went through at the very end, TFDM will try to automatically fill that slot. If you're inside the static time horizon, however, you do have that protection period to make a decision if you want to substitute another flight into that. Otherwise, you lose the slot. This one actually comes back to ATD-2 a little bit. Can I just flag a flight as high priority and send that to TFDM? Again, the short answer is no. So TFDM doesn't go by high priority flags like TFMS and or ATD-2's priority messages. However, that doesn't preclude operators from making a business decision on their own internal business tools to mark flights for priority and then letting automation on your end submit substitution requests.
I was going to make that point as well. We talked to different vendors because some people have expressed, well, they like the priority flag that ATD-2 has. They don't have the direct flight for flight substitution here. And the vendors expressed they can run the software in a way to make it appear as if it's a priority flag. But one of the things that I recognize from talking to different people is who do you put a priority flag on? If you're putting it on JFK, LaGuardia, Charlotte, Atlanta, Chicago O'Hare, they probably already have an edict and an APREC. And TFDM is giving them a priority in its own way by determining their release time, figuring out a way to get them to the runway anyway. You might not even need that priority flag in that scenario. Mike brought up crew timeout issues. Hopefully TFDM will be more reliable on the surface times and giving you accurate times when an aircraft is going to get to the runway. So you could do substitution and bring that crew timeout aircraft up in your list as much as you possibly can. And then if you see from the software and the TTP and everything you're getting back that that time's not good enough, that's when you could either call the tower and start coordinating. But hopefully you wouldn't have to do manual coordination all the time.
So one more, can I just call the tower and request the flight be substituted in the SMP? The answer is also no. Substitution requests must be done through the TFCS interface. So just a high-level kind of overview of the different interfaces and kind of how they all align. So we just talked about TFCS. So the other feeds that are required for surface metering, achieving the benefits from the user side, of course, TFM data, submitting things like EOBTs. The TTPs, that's where you're going to be able to see your surface metering times, so things like ETOTs changings, confirmation that TMATs and TOBTs have been updated. And then also, of course, the TFCS, and that's the request reply for substitution messages. The other one that's actually included that hasn't been talked about is the TBFM metering information service. So this will provide information on TBFM metering times and statuses. That's a feed, swim feed. So just kind of a recap on TFCS. So it is a request reply service meant for flight operators and FAA, TFDM system. We've spent quite a bit of time on the flight substitution business functions. There's actually a second business function for airport data, and this is where users can submit messages for gridlock and ramp statuses, such as the ramp closures, like Eric was talking about. You know, if there's a thunderstorm, you need to close a ramp resource for a period of time. That can be submitted through TFCS. So quick data structure, substitutions is a request message, then a response message, essentially a confirmation. And then the airport data side has the same requests and responses for both closures and then also the gridlock messages. And I'll turn over to Eric for the looking ahead.
Well, so only one other thing I want to add to what we just said was TFDM knows that you're going to have to develop tools in order to ingest this data and submit data. They're going to create test feeds in the future so that you'll be able to get a data dump and be able to test out the tools that you develop. So that's in the works. I don't know if I have too much for looking ahead other than we need to start thinking about policies, procedures, tools, finding your vendors, figuring out how you're going to make it work. Like I was saying earlier, determining who gets to make certain decisions on substitution. Is that at the IOC or the AOC, or is that at the ramp tower? And how you're going to make that work. Because some of these decisions might be 4 or 5 minute decisions. Pretty dynamic. The other thing that came up as a side question was, I think, applicable to this in the sense of CDM data and who has the rights to see it and develop tools. So I think the easy answer for that now, as far as I understand with CDM through the CSG, is if you're entitled to see CDM data, you can develop the tool. If you're not entitled right now, you need to get a sponsorship from someone who is entitled to see CDM data, an airline, an airport that signed the MOA, some other provider. And then that would entitle you to be able to start developing a tool and seeing data. Until you have that sponsorship, I'm not sure that you're able to get in to like the NASA TTP feed and start ingesting data and analyzing how you would process that.
So I'm looking at the questions that are submitted electronically, and just going to run down, I think, the first couple that are high, and then we'll open back up probably to the floor. So does having an edict or an APRAC exempt you from an SMP, or does it only exempt you from being able to substitute within an SMP? So it does not exempt you from an SMP. You'll still get surface metering times, again, to actually achieve those CTDs, whether it's an edict or a TBFM APRAC CFR time. What it does do is we'll assign you 0 metering hold above and beyond what you might take some delay just to meet that runway time, but that's not metering hold due to the surface metering program, and you won't receive any other additional metering hold from that surface metering program. If you do have an edict, you are exempt from or cannot substitute, and then APRACs, if you have a time, you cannot substitute, but if you don't have a time, there is the local decision that can be made whether to allow substitutions for those flights that don't have CFRs that are still part of a TBFM program.
Kind of back to what I was saying before, TFDM does not want to in any way negatively impact the overhead stream, so we're trying to make sure as best we can that they get the aircraft to the runway at the time that they're released. I think that was one of the very interesting results of ATD-2 that I saw recently was a dramatic increase at Charlotte on their accuracy at hitting those times. And that has a net positive effect that the TRACON and the centers around them felt very comfortable and started reducing some of their restrictions based on how well they were doing with their times now. So you're not exempt from surface metering, but the times that you get are going to help you meet your overhead stream times. Another interesting, just aside, is you'll get TOBTs if you have an APREC or an edict outside of surface metering for what the system thinks you should push back in order to make your time to the runway based on the algorithms of what's going on currently.
Right. And those TOBTs are recommended times, so their compliance will not be measured against them. But Eric's point, if you're aware that you have a CTD, which is being published on TTP, and you have a TOBT but not a TMAT, it's kind of a clue that you're not part of a surface metering program, but you do have a controlled time of departure. And it's TFDM's best guess of, and it's a good guess, of how many airplanes are going to be in front of you in the surface, what your ramp transit time is, what your active movement transit time is. So it's basically a decision support help to the operators of a guess of when you should be pushing back and beginning your taxi in order to meet those times. There was a second question about, and I think I already answered this, but if the flights receives an updated edict, maybe the GDP gets updated or ground stop gets lifted and you just roll right into a GDP, or a CFR time gets rescheduled, the TMAT will update and will be published out over TTP. The next one that I see is where can we get a full list of substitution rules? So these will be discussed as part of the CSIP visits. They'll also be included in the user guide that Eric had mentioned before, a little more explanation of those rules and how they apply in different situations. There's more 3T type questions. I'll probably, there's some questions here about reconciliation. I saw these questions before actually twice between APRACs and edicts and ETOTs. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this since it's not really substitution, but ETOTs do, yes.
On the rule,
Yeah, so these slides are going, the full list. Yeah, we can take an action to provide that, yeah. So the reconciliation, so ETOTs will take those times into account. If APRACs and edicts don't match though, TFDM takes these, the ETOT that TFDM is predicting will try to meet the CFR over the edict. Come find me afterwards if you have more questions about that. Do you have... flight substitution, is flight substitution limited to the flights going to the same runway? No, they just have to be part of the same program. So if you're running a runway only SMP, then if 2 airplanes are going to different runways and one's not part of that runway SMP, then it can't be substituted. But as long as they're part of the same SMP, that's the crucial data piece.
Yeah, there was one question. It was, can I change runways? You can change runways, but if it's not part of the SMP, you're taking yourself out of the SMP, and then there's not available for substitution.
Is there any other hand-raising questions? No way.
So, do you have, Melissa, do you have a slot swapping tool right now?
For
For
TFDM?
TIF, yes.
No.
Does anybody? Well, the reason I'm asking is that I think this would be a very good thing to put via maybe the CDM surface team to do some human-in-the-loop testing as well as review of the needs of both. Hopefully we have all our bases covered. This is new for me as a flight operator, and there's raises a lots of questions, and I would hate to come to 2021 and we didn't look at it between now and then, and just a recommendation.
Sure. So, yeah, send all your questions to the CSIT at FAA.gov or to me directly, and we'll address them. I'm on the Surface CDM team, so we can bring them up there. As they're saying, the technology is not fully mature yet, so at this point in time, we might have some ability to have influence. There's a question, will vendors be able to connect to TFCS on behalf of an airline? My belief is if they're sponsored by the airline, they can do so. And that's how it stands now. And changing those rules, I think Mike made a reference to that earlier in a different presentation. That's not FAA imposed. That's kind of a CDM data sensitivity issue, and it would be CDM that would change rules on that if there was a push to do so.
Since this loosely is related to substitution, benefits require TFMS, TBFM, TTP, and TFCS. In future, TTP will be replaced by TFDM, though, correct? So the current NASA TTP feed is modeled after TFDM's TTP feed, and when TFDM deploys, I think this was mentioned yesterday, that configuration A and B sites will have TTPs. It's just a matter of what kind of data is on there. So every TFDM site will have a TTP feed.
I think we'll take one more question off of that, and then
Here, I'll read this one. In the LAX example, surface demand from 1600 1900 being projected at 1400 when issuing an SMP. EOBTs could change significantly in a short period of time. What does that do to the stability of an SMP issued 3 to 5 hours in advance?
so the look ahead's variable by site. So if you decide in your airport, maybe you're East Coast or West Coast, and you want to have an 8-hour look ahead, you could do that, but you could have a 2-hour look ahead. So there is a variability there that's adaptable by site.
And the idea behind these operations is that most airports know, every day at Philly, for example, from 4 to 6, they get the first push, and then from about 7 to about 11 p.m., they get another pretty major push as all the internationals are going out. So there is some, there's ideas that these SMPs will be not a one-off thing that, the sky is falling and we're trying to rectify a situation. It's every day you get the same queues, the same traffic volumes, just about, things may shift by 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, but it's the same amount of flights are going out on a normal day. So these SMPs theoretically could be just issued as every day from that period during that departure push, much like ATD-2 with certain banks. The SMPs will run. So even though there's variations of the EOBTs, TFDM will update for those, or TFDM departure schedule updates based on those changes and will respond. So, if information is being published in, EOBT is being updated, TFDM will update, but the SMP can still execute, and the goal of the SMP is to limit the time that the operators are having engines out there on the surface, taxiing, grumpy passengers because they're number 26 in line on a runway versus, sitting there and still having their phones and their computers open. So the goals of SMPs, even though there's those small changes, kind of much more tactically, the TFDM will respond, and the eventual outcome of the SMP is still managing the queue lengths at airports, and it will respond to those data updates till we get to the freeze horizon. And then after that, it's just a matter of what data is being driving those updates. So again, CTDs, for example.
I think also there's a sense of alarm sometimes about surface metering, but I think it's, if you look at what NASA did here with, at Charlotte, and what the modeling shows from us, most airports are looking at 10-15% of the aircraft in a surface metering program getting delays of 5, 6, 7 minutes. JFK excluded, Ralph. I'm sorry, that's different, but really it's kind of a gentle tool, but because of economies of scale, there's enormous savings in fuel and there's great reductions in CO2 emissions. So.
And even though the substitution can, seems like a lot, it's designed to help you, the user, have flexibility of still meeting those intentions and the goals of the FAA to smooth out the queues and smooth out the surface. So it's all about prediction, and with you guys knowing the surface metering times and knowing your own business operations, substitution just lets you have a little more flexibility over when your planes are departing, given constraint of an SMP.
Another just quick point is TMATs have a window around them. We imagine plus or minus 5, again, adjustable by airport, for your operation. At Kennedy, they do plus or minus 7. So if it's your worry about hitting the TMAT, you really have like a 10-minute window. So it would normally, for the substitution to happen, it would have to be something where you're really delaying the one flight or trying desperately to bump another flight up. So are there any more questions? No? Thank you so much. We really appreciate your
We're being cut
interactions.
off.
Oh, one more. We got one more. I'm sorry.
So TFDM is going to come out October 2020, but the TFCS isn't coming out till, it was just on last screen,
So
2021.
TFCS is part of the configuration A's, which Charlotte's the first key site.
So what they're saying is TFCS will be out for Charlotte.
Yeah. So to echo Mike here, since some of the back are looking like you can hear. So Phoenix is next year in 2020. That's only build 1. So TFCS and surface metering will not be part of that. But it's starting in Charlotte in 2021 and then going back and retrofitting Phoenix and LAX. If it's a surface metering site, configuration A site, then it'll have the TFCS. Config A.
And if you have
27 sites.
If you have any other questions, you can find us. We'll talk. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.